And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Adjusted Perspective, the podcast by chiropractic students for chiropractic students. And today we have a real exciting episode. We are talking about the vertebral subluxation. And this is incredibly important to our profession because this is what we are founded on, right? Every chiropractor can agree that what we do is we find and correct a subluxation. So we're going to get into what is it, what is the history behind it, what is the vertebral subluxation complex, and then what is the physiology behind the adjustment? Why are we adjusting? Why are we searching for these so, meticulously and what we're doing? So again, my name is Eddie. We got Carson, Gabe, and CJ, and let's get started. We got a wonderful episode today. So first things first, CJ, you want to take us off a little bit of the history behind the subluxation, who founded it, and how we got here?
Sure. So the initial premise of subluxation, and people always want to try and pin DD for, like, he came up with the subluxation in a dream, or he heard about it from a ghost, and he wanted to take it from there in 1895, and all of a sudden built this whole entire chiropractic empire off of the Christian Science version of what a subluxation is, and that's just simply isn't the case. So in 1895, when DD had initially adjusted Henri Leonard, it was a culmination of the science that he had spent 10 years learning about, right? Mm-hmm. So he had been researching anatomy. Again, we had went over in the last episode about how he was a magnetic healer, what that actually meant at the time, right? Magnetic healing wasn't actually anything really mystical, right? It had very similar applications to something like massage therapy. Some of the slap massages that we were talking about with some of our buddies today that know their philosophy and their history pretty well. But the subluxation was the point in which DD adjusted, right? It was the point of dysfunction. It was the initial premise that the bone at a place causing impingement on the nerve, not necessarily pinching the nerve, but impingement on the nerve was causing the excitation of the nerve at that level and then affecting the organs that were connected to that spinal level. So some very simple premises that people always thought about with chiropractic, especially in the early 1900s, was if you had the splanchnic nerves coming out of the T5, T6 area, those go to the ganglia, then go directly to the stomach. So if you adjusted that specific vertebrae, then it would help. That organ that it was connected to. Obviously, we have advanced a lot in our science and our understanding of physiology as we have moved forward over the course of the past 130 years. To subluxation meaning something almost completely different. And what people also have to understand, and a very common misconception, when DD had initially started, and he was teaching MDs at the time and osteopaths, and teaching people who wanted to learn the science, the art, and the philosophy of chiropractic, people were getting thrown in jail for practicing medicine. So what was something that we could say that we were taking care of, that we are evaluating in our patients, that would allow us not to get thrown in jail? And one thing that he had always compared the profession to in terms of how he would get it to survive was something like Christian Science. So for people who don't know something, when it comes to Christian Science, they have their own set of rules that they can abide by under the law with how they treat people. They can use prayer, they can use other things in order to treat their patients. So he had compared it to Christian Science, said this term subluxation is something that chiropractors take care of specifically, and then connected it to the Christian Science. Mm-hmm. So initially, was it connected to the Christian Science? Yes. But we have a really good understanding, especially over the last 130 years, with research, with how docs have taken care of things. It's obviously changed a little bit, but we have something that we call subluxation that isn't connected to the old school Christian Science-esque thing that just was designed to keep the thousands of chiropractors from going to jail for practicing medicine without a license. So that is kind of the history behind the original term of subluxation. You guys can read more about that in the 1910 and some of the older texts.
So, that's all incredible. I mean, D.D. Palmer was the first one to establish subluxation in 1895 when he adjusted Henri Leonard. And like you briefly mentioned, he was a magnetic healer. And what that means in today's age, we're not necessarily sure because there's none of them left. So we don't know what they required. But D.D. Palmer was an anatomist. Like, he studied the human body very, very well through and through. You can see it through some of his texts, like the 1910 that we have right there. And this subluxation premise that he had come up with, back then, it was the bone-on-nerve theory that some people still carry today, but very easily explained. It's you have these vertebral bodies, you have the vertebra, and then through the IVF, the spinal nerves come out. Because the spine, what is it? It's the housing unit for the central nervous system. Through the IVFs, the spinal nerves come out, innervate the rest of the body. So what he had believed was that if a bone becomes out of place, right, not so much that it's breaking its physiological boundaries, that's why it's called a subluxation, right? It's not so much a dislocation, but it's moved into an abnormal position that can apply pressure on the nerve, which can then alter the innate intelligence. And I want to take a second to talk a little bit about the innate intelligence, because this is a premise that's talked about a lot in chiropractic school and in chiropractic. And really briefly explained, the innate intelligence is the law of nature that keeps the body alive, right? You have a universal intelligence. If you talk about not Stevenson but Strauss' book, the universal intelligence is everything that's keeping everything together, and the innate intelligence is the things is the thing that is directing us to stay alive. Now, these premises were developed also in the very early 1900s, late 1800s. We now understand them to be a little bit different, but that was what they were talking about when they were saying restoring life force. The subluxation is impinging on the body's ability to communicate the innate intelligence. We now understand that it's something much more, but what they were trying to explain was that the central nervous system is being impinged, it's being bothered, and because of that, further down the line, there are issues. So that's what the innate intelligence is, because I know that there's so many misconceptions about what it is that they group us in with yogis and with voodoo, like science, and the innate intelligence is what they use with their limited knowledge to explain a premise as complicated as the central nervous system. So,
yeah, I think another thing to add to that point, and kind of you touched on it, CJ, also, is that as we are in an age now where we are able to conduct research at a higher level than was possible in 1910. And as we've seen new literature come out about our profession, and we've been able to find out more about the human body, it's easy to sit in 2025 knowing what we know now and to go back and try to criticize some of the things that were said and maybe some of the ways that the Palmers went about establishing this profession in the United States. It's easy to sit here now and look back and criticize and go, okay, all this vitalism, this life force, this innate intelligence stuff, we can now explain this as, functions of the nervous system or the immune system or whatnot. And we have that kind of science background now. But I think that if we take just an objective look at it, we really should have an appreciation for what the Palmers did early on in bringing chiropractic to light, because people, will take a look at chiropractic now and, say what they want to say about it. But from the early stages, just the history of, the AMA and chiropractic battles, they believed so heavily in what they were doing, even with the lack of research, and saw the results that it was getting. And so they pushed hard to be able to see this, profession come to fruition. And, they had to do it in a way that, every person wanting to practice this, this amazing practice wouldn't just be thrown in jail, and it wouldn't see the light of day. So even just being able to see what they did, tying it into, the vitalism that actually helped propel this profession forward, keeping, chiropractors in practice, I think that we can all appreciate it, even though we have come to some more scientific discoveries where, the exact model is not what we're, claiming on a daily basis now for what chiropractic is today. But I do think we have to give, DD and BJ, they were human beings. They had flaws and everything. They weren't right about everything, but we do have to give them their flowers on the fact of helping this profession, see the light of day today in 2025.
Yeah, Carson, I 100% agree. And Heidi Havoc, who we talk about a little bit, we're going to be talking about a little bit later. One of the things that she says is it's very important to give the Palmers a shout out, right? Like give our forefathers a shout out, because obviously they weren't 100% right on everything, right? Like there's some things that they got wrong because the understanding of the human body just wasn't there, but they were really close. Like there was some stuff that they got pretty well, like at least like the major premise of it, specifically when you're talking about the thoughts, traumas, and toxins, and now how we understand that stress, inflammation, and injury, like the effects that can have on the nervous system and the effects that it can have on the human body. It's important to give them homage. We don't have to abide religiously to what they said and what they did, but it's always important to look back on history and look like, hey, what was this subluxation that they're talking about? What is it today? And were they kind of on par with what they were talking about with the information that they had.
And real quick before we move on, because Gabe, we'll get to you the second point that you had set apart, and I'll let you start us off with that. But I wanted to just go over a couple of the definitions of how subluxation has kind of changed over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 1927, so people don't know, R.W. Stevenson wrote the 14th volume of the Green Book. So obviously there's over 50 Green Books that you can read that are based off of. You can kind of see how the profession grew in philosophy, science, and art over the last 130 years. But R.W. Stevenson wanted to put with the original writings of D.D. Palmer, B.J. Palmer, and one other writer into a book that students could read throughout their time at Palmer. And this is back in 1927. But the way that he defined subluxation, just to kind of bring it through over the years. So a subluxation is the condition of a vertebrae that has lost its proper juxtaposition with the one above or the one below or both, to an extent less than a luxation, which impinges nerves and interferes with the transmission of mental impulses. Clarence Gonstead, so the Gonstead technique, of the chapters that were written in 1957 that a lot of people still like to go off of that definition, talks about the malpositioning of a vertebrae having slipped off its disc slightly with the shifting of the nucleus causing the bulging of the annulus and the nucleus out the back causing an impingement on the nerve. But then we can get towards more of a modern understanding of it. So in 2006, so the World Health Organization, and a lot of people don't understand this, there are chiropractors on the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has its own division of worldwide doctors that are chiropractors, which is also really cool. Dr. Alatar, as we talked about on last week's episode, has been a part of that for a long time, or was a part of that. So in 2006, or 2005, the World Health Organization defines it as a lesion or dysfunction in a joint or motion segment in which alignment, movement, integrity, and or physiological function are altered. Although contact between joint surfaces remains intact, it is essentially a functional entity which may influence biomechanical and neural integrity. And then finally, getting to our favorite definition, Heidi Havoc, one of the leading chiropractic researchers in the world. And she makes a really cool distinction here, and she gives the ICD-10 code. So for people who don't know, we have ICD-10 codes and CPT codes. So we're documenting what we're doing for legal purposes and then for insurance purposes as well, and just for us to track what we're doing. There's an actual code for subluxation for somatic and segmental dysfunction of a vertebral joint. She makes that in there at ICD-10 CM code M99.1. We're very familiar with that, especially having done it all the time in our last year of learning. But she says, it is characterized by abnormal movement or function of spinal segments, which is identified by clinical markers such as restricted intersegmental range of motion, tenderness upon palpation, palpable asymmetric intervertebral muscle tension, and altered joint play and feel. Vertebral subluxation involves altered afferent input from muscle spindles in the paraspinal muscles at the subluxated levels. This disruption in sensory input can cause maladaptive central neuroplastic changes, resulting in impaired sensory motor integration and control. These maladaptive central plastic changes in the central nervous system, CNS, can worsen over time, which is thought to contribute to dysfunction, pain, and other symptoms by disrupting normal sensory motor control. So you can kind of see how we went from a very simplistic juxtaposition, bone out of place, interrupting mental impulse, all the way to the advanced understanding of the nervous system now. And I will say our understanding of intersystematic workings of the nervous system and function of the nervous system is still not where it's going to be in 20 more years. So I'm really excited to see how the science advances so we can understand what we're doing as chiropractors and as a profession.
Yeah, and to kind of hone us back in, and I want to make sure that those of you that are watching that may not be as knowledgeable in the subject, kind of like maybe get the points that we're trying to make. Mm-hmm. So basically the main question here that we just all talked about was, what is a subluxation? And you guys all obviously just gave like a really good kind of like deep dive breakdown throughout the years. Mm-hmm. So when most people hear the word subluxation, they either picture like a bone out of place or they have no idea what it means. And I think we can all agree that that's one of the biggest things that we struggle with here is, like you guys always mention, the semantics of it. Like people thinking it's one thing, then other people thinking it's another, and then you have the group that just really doesn't know. They're just, here to crack backs. So before we move on, I just kind of wanted to end this point here. What is a subluxation? So going off of what CJ said, traditionally chiropractors like DD and BJ, they described it as a spinal bone that had moved out of alignment that is compressing a nerve and blocking the body's innate intelligence. So what Eddie touched on earlier. Mm-hmm. Gonstead kind of took, I believe, a mechanical-esque spin on that, using X-ray analysis to kind of pinpoint those misalignments and correct them with his hyper-specific adjustments, being really like, nitty gritty and specific on each segment. Then, what we kind of like, I feel like more aligned with, Leonard Faye, a Canadian chiropractor, who we think is probably one of the more key thinkers behind modern chiropractic. He kind of said, hold up, subluxation isn't a static thing. It's not a bone sitting in the wrong place. It's a dynamic lesion. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's all about movement. God created us to move. We're not meant to be sedentary. So Leonard Faye thought all about movement or the lack of movement that we didn't have. So Faye's model emphasizes spinal dysfunction, not a visible misalignment, affecting the local soft tissues, joint motion, and nervous system output. So that kind of starts to point us more towards Heidi Havoc, how she kind of like views it. In his view, subluxation is more understood as a joint that just isn't functioning properly. So that loss of motion changes the nervous system senses and how the nervous system responds to the body. And now I know we were in Miami. I know we mentioned it last episode.
About a month ago.
Yeah, about a month ago. And I mean, that was almost like pinpoint what Heidi Havoc was really talking about, how, we have these like muscles, these minor muscles and ligaments throughout our spine that are so tiny, and their main thing is proprioception. So, our nervous system is trying to function properly, and it's trying to gain proprioception from that area. But if the joint isn't functioning properly and it isn't moving properly, then we aren't able to get that proprioception from that area. So that's kind of like, I hope for you guys listening that was more of like a simpler breakdown of it, and that you guys can kind of take what everyone said, use what they said to kind of deeper dive into it. But I just wanted to give like a pretty brief overview of how it has changed throughout the years.
Can I add one last point to your
Yeah.
thing? And Gabe said this word multiple times, and it's a word that we sit and talk about often in our own discussions. The thing that everybody has in common, regardless of the vocabulary or language that's being used, is everybody here is focused on function. Like at the end of the day, it all comes down to is your spine and is your nervous system functioning properly. And I think that if we're confused when this subluxation word comes up, and we're not really sure what to do with it, if we're early on in school, or for those of you out just in the public, I think that what you can recognize is that at the core of what chiropractors like to do, whether they like to approach it from more of a structural model or more of a dynamic or static, whatever your preference is in the language that you use to try to describe it, what we are all trying to do is to go look at the spine and find where is the spine not functioning as it was designed to, finding areas of dysfunction, and whatever technique that you're into or your philosophy behind what you do. Every guy here, Didi, BJ, Henri, Gillet, Leonard Faye, Clarence Gonstead, Heidi Havoc, all have a main goal of going and restoring function so that your spine biomechanically can move properly, your nervous system can function properly. And so I just wanted to add that. It's helpful for me to get the super, layman's term definition of it. And at the end of the day, we are focused on restoring function.
And I 100% agree with you. I read this in Plogger's biomechanical approach to chiropractic. Plogger is a Gonstead doc, and that's the whole thing about the biomechanical approach. It's a mechanical and biomechanical approach, the Gonstead way of looking at it. And he wrote, most chiropractors can agree that we deal with lesions of the spine. In that definition, you will find some combination of the structural abnormality and the consequential alterations of function. So you're right on the ball there. All chiropractors, we work with the spine, we find dysfunctions at segmental units of the spine, and that's why, when you brought up Faye's dynamic perspective of it, that's probably my favorite perspective of it, because he goes, and instead of looking at what's happening at the nerve and what's happening at the disc and looking at the effects, he takes an approach where he looks more okay, what is the mechanism that is pulling the bone out of place? And he takes a really deep dive, him and Gillet, into the soft tissues surrounding, supporting, and moving these vertebrae, the interspinalis, the intertransversari, the multifidus, the rotatoris, those muscles that you brought up earlier as being highly proprioceptive and highly mechanoreceptive, and what a dysfunction at those muscles and at those soft tissues, what that can cause down the line, right? The pathophysiology that can cause down the line. And that's why I like his perspective about it a lot, because ultimately when we adjust, right, you're not necessarily putting a bone back in place. You're more likely than not affecting those structures, right? You're affecting the intervertebral muscles, the ligaments, the soft tissues, the disc even. So when his perspective was aimed at looking at those things first, it really made everything start to make a lot of sense for me.
Yeah, and so I think with everything that we've said, we can kind of move into like our next big topic, and I think that's kind of like discussing the physiology of subluxation, or more so like how the subluxation affects the body itself. Now, for me, and my opinions, this is where I think Henri Gillet comes in.
Oh,
He's a Belgian chiropractor. He studied live spinal joints in motion, and he developed what we know and is in this lovely book right there at the top as the fixation theory. He identified 3 types of joint restrictions. I'm going to focus on 2 today, mainly just the muscular fixations and ligamentous. I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think those are the 2 more common ones that you will find, muscular being the most common.
And those are the ones that we can have an effect on,
that
right?
we can actually
Muscular
fix.
Fixations we can fix. Ligamentous fixations over time we can fix. The last one is a degeneration, right?
Yeah.
Articular, that's degeneration, and a lot of the times...
That's that pathophysiological process where after, so long of being in this chronic state of lack of movement, that's when that process kind of comes into play. But I think that it's smart to kind of focus on those 2.
Yeah. And so muscular fixation, they're often the result of, something is small, or I guess for some people, this isn't as small, but, stress, poor posture, or trauma or injuries. They're relatively easy to reverse, as you were just saying. But ligamentous fixations, they happen inside the joint itself. So what Gillet called interarticular adhesions. These are the kind of restrictions that are often need what we call an adjustment. So how does the subluxation develop in the first place? A basic example would be like a microtrauma, just, micro tears, or just, even just like sitting down in your car the wrong way. It could be something as simple as just like sitting too long, like us in class, poor lifting mechanics if you're at the gym, or I'm going into my closet to pick up a box, or helping my mom take the Christmas decorations down. Even emotional stress can cause a subluxation, which I know you mentioned thoughts, traumas, and toxins earlier. That kind of goes along with that as well. These factors cause inflammation in the periarticular disc, or soft tissues, thick capsules, ligaments that are within the facet joints. And then that inflammation sensitizes the joint, alters the muscle tone around it, and then that is what leads to our limited motion. So over time, the nervous system adapts badly for long term, but it's also just trying to protect the body. But it starts processing the altered proprioceptive input from that joint, and that's when things like kind of begin to snowball, kind of fall into place, leading from muscular to ligamentous to what you were saying earlier as the degenerative articular fixations. So all of this is kind of like what Gillet meant when he said that the joint isn't just restricted, it's neurologically stuck. And it affects not just the joint, but the reflex loops between the spine, the brain, and the muscles around it.
I would love to I'm going to pose this question, maybe pass it over to you, because I really enjoy the way that you explain, especially the neural component of what's going on, and maybe you can touch on that if you see fit. But what I really think is interesting, and we've said these names a lot, we like to talk about their dynamic model and their language of how they explain the subluxation with these words like fixation and restriction. So we've said the name Leonard Faye a lot. Leonard Faye studied under Henri Gillet in Belgium, went over there, kind of learned his techniques, his process. And for those of you that are in school, Henri Gillet was kind of what we call the founder of motion palpation, this technique that some of the people on the dynamic side of chiropractic who fall into that philosophy like to engage in this process called motion palpation. But so Leonard Faye, based off of all this research and all these findings that Henri Gillet came up with, Leonard Faye wanted to kind of create this model of the components of the subluxation. And now it's a model, it's not like a static definition. And Leonard Faye came up with this 5-component model. And originally in his book that released in the 1980s, or his textbook that he put out, he called it the subluxation complex. Now, there's a couple different... The subluxation complex, as we know it today, is not necessarily the one that Leonard Faye came up with now, because there were some other people that coined the term subluxation complex, still referring to more of a static model. In his recent podcasts and as he talks now, he likes to call it the biopsychosocial model of the subluxation. And so I'll kind of pass this over to CJ, but there's a 5-component model that has talks about it from a movement standpoint, a pathological standpoint, a neural standpoint, and those 5 points are kinesiopathology, neuropathophysiology, myopathology, histopathology, and pathophysiology, biomechanical changes.
All right, so this is what we're going to do. I want you to say, you're going to say all 5 of those. You're going to say one, and I'm going to explain it, and then you say the next one, and I'll explain it. I'll try to explain it as simply as I possibly can.
I got some notes on it here, so in
Wonderful.
case we can throw it.
And I just want to pull this up real quick.
So give you the first one. You said kinesiopathology, right?
Yes, kinesiopathology.
So people have to understand, and what Gabe had always said to me when we kind of first started really getting into the motion palpation system and not really knowing too much about it, Gabe always said, CJ, like the spine, it's living, it's dynamic, it's functional, it's always moving. The breakdown of movement is what initially causes the hypomobility in the spine when there's damage to that. And obviously there's other psychosocial things that can go on with thoughts, traumas, toxins, but that kind of deserves its own thing, and I can talk about that maybe in a later episode or maybe just a little bit later on in this one. When people are growing up and they're developing, especially from like the ages 0 to 18, people always want to say that the discs they're innervated internally, that there's blood flow going to the inside of the disc, but really the disc is sealed and it's pressurized, and that's why people typically up until the age of 18 have relatively healthy spines. But in as little as one day, or whether it's a trauma, whether a person they stop moving and they kind of sit with a slump posture, the depressurization of the disc and the damage of the Sharpie fibers on the annulus of the disc is what begins the hypermobility and the inflammatory phase. And this can happen very minimally, and there's MRI and CT of people doing disc, of different researchers doing disc studies, where they're starting to see the damage of the annular fibers and the Sharpie fibers and the depressurization of the disc as early as people in their 20s. So people say, well, why do I have chronic back pain? I'm only in my 20s. It only takes, as little as one day of not doing something you're supposed to begin disc degeneration. And also what people need to understand, when it comes to chiropractic, we have minimal effect on disc degeneration. And I think most chiropractors would agree on that. But what we can do is improve the mobility of those spinal segments to make sure that the neurological impulse that's going from the paraspinal musculature, from the mechanoreceptors, proprioceptors, and the Golgi tendon organs can relay up to the brain and make sure that inflammatory levels are decreased. Okay, so then the next thing that you had said is
Then we have the neuropathophysiology, where we look at the irritation from the facilitation standpoint and degeneration.
When the disc begins to eventually break down, and Gabe was talking about the facet pathology that goes along with that, and for all, what we'll explain is the facet joint is also called the meniscoid joint, so we have the meniscoid fiber or the meniscoid nerves that are going into it. So even though we have the disc that's minimally innervated, you have the high sensitization innervation of the facets. So even though the facet breakdown isn't always necessarily the first thing to go, the protection and the inflammation and the swelling that goes to the area of the vertebrae and of the disc is what ends up causing those sticky facets and the facets to stop. So another thing that I want to explain is the disc. So people also think that it's a fluid motion of the disc, but really the annulus, it's cartilaginous, type 2 cartilaginous joint. It's made of 7 annular layers, 7 layers of annular fibers, and then you have the Sharpie fibers as well. So even though you have the depressurization and the disc isn't necessarily shooting out the back as soon as it gets damaged, you have the damage of the Sharpie fibers and the increase of calcium that then goes into the disc and it hardens it. So no longer is it as movable as it was before, but now you have the calcium moving into the joint to protect it. So when we have trauma to a joint, you're going to have the the swelling of that area. You're going to have the paraspinal musculature that are then going to not move as a result of the disc being protected. The lack of mechanoreception and proprioception of the deep paraspinal musculature, so we're talking about the interspinalis, the multifidus, and the rotary longus and brevis, not sending that signal to the prefrontal cortex is going to release interleukins, hyperthalamic pituitary axis, release interleukins to the area surrounding those vertebrae. So that's why we have an increase of blood flow going to those vertebrae. So that's kind of the role of muscle. When the bone is injured or the disc is injured, the muscle will stop moving, and then you have the increase of inflammatory markers then going to that area, then relayed back up to the brain. A little long-winded.
That was good.
Did not explain that as well as I wanted to, but maybe do a different video on that.
That was really good. We hit several of the
We can definitely break it down
key points,
a little bit more, and we'll be posting other videos that hopefully will be able to kind of space these things out and help you guys kind of like understand on a deeper level instead of, I know we're going to have a lot of students that watch this, but then at the same time we might have some other people that are considering this. But yeah, we'll definitely break that down for you guys in another video.
Really quick, before we move on, I just want to redefine the vertebral subluxation complex. So we brought up what it is, and when Faye is talking about the vertebral subluxation complex, he's talking about the 5 components that can be found in response to a subluxation, right? And then over there it says subluxation, and then it says something along the lines of like a very a complex clinical entity comprising of one or more of the following. And we have all of those 5 components. And so what the vertebral subluxation complex means, really put into layman's terms, is that if you have restriction at a joint, at a facet, at a segmental spinal unit, that can lead to any of these listed: the neuropathophysiology, like he talked about, the kinesiopathophysiology, histopathology, biomechanical changes, etc. So that's what we mean when we say vertebral subluxation complex. It's subluxation, restriction, fixation, leads to these 5 things.
And Leonard Faye makes that apparent. He describes it as he created a heuristic model, which is really just a problem-solving model.
Yes.
It's like when a chiropractor goes to approach this situation, what things am I looking for that can commonly show up in this subluxation entity that we've been talking about? 100%. So not looking at it as a static definition, every single thing needs to be present right now and all this, because it really is, it's like a process. There's the early stages of what, the subluxation causes, and then there's the person that, is 85 years old, kind of lives a sedentary lifestyle, hasn't been to the chiropractor ever before. They walk into the office, that complex is going to look a little bit different from them with all those, and like we talked about with the different types of fixations there's going to be a little bit more of those articular fixation where there's this chronic degeneration, lack of function, and all kinds of different things. So it really is, Eddie just hit it on the head, and I just wanted to be clear that Faye did describe it as a heuristic model. It's you're going to look for these things when you're approaching this process.
100%.
Yeah, I think we hit that.
Yeah,
pretty good.
We did.
Really good. And you brought something up about like the development of it, and that's why I love the way that Faye and the dynamic model, they start by talking about muscular fixations, because muscular fixations can then, with further degeneration, the muscles will fibrose, and then they will cause those ligaments to calcify. You'll find meniscoid entrapments, and then that will then lead to the articular degeneration down the line. So one leads to the other, which leads to the other. I love the approach of the muscular fixation first, because Gillet specifically in his Belgium chiropractic notes, he talks about what he calls a sympathetic vicious cycle, which gives an awesome explanation as to why the bone became subluxated in the first place. Right? He talks about the intervertebral muscles that you have. So you have the intertransversari, the spinalis, the rotors, those muscles, and how they became spasm in the first place. And he really simply put says that these muscles, when they spasm, it's not so much like a Charlie horse, but more of that hypertonus that Didi and BJ talked about a lot, right? It's a extended contracture. You can feel this when you're palpating up and down a patient's spine, and this will happen because the sympathetic chain will take over, right? When there is any stimulus that is either too large in duration or too large in amount, these muscles will enter that hypertonic state, and it will create a self-replicating, a self-continuing vicious sympathetic cycle, which will cause them to be pulled out of place. And then if that happens there too long, muscles begin to fibrose, ligaments begin to calcify because they're adapting to their new range of motion, which then causes the arthritic changes, the degenerative changes, which could then even, like the previous models thought, due to the inflammation, lead to pressure on the nerve, right? Like it's one step to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other. That's why the muscular fixations are super important, because if you can get on top of that before it leads to all these other things, then you're helping the patient a lot down the line.
Yeah, and so now that we've kind of broken down what a subluxation really is, I think we got to discuss, obviously, I think what anybody that is considering chiropractic, someone that is interested in going to their chiropractor but isn't really sure, how does an adjustment fix it? What does the adjustment actually do? Mm-hmm. So I speak a lot about Gillet. I'm a big fan of Gillet. I agree with a lot of things that he has put out. So that's why I keep mentioning him. But so according to Gillet, when you deliver a chiropractic adjustment, especially at a high velocity, low amplitude thrust, you can literally gap the facet joint. That gapping is what is breaking up the adhesions. It releases the stuck meniscoids and restores normal joint mechanics. While Leonard Faye explains it in a little bit of a different way, but he says the adjustment acts as a neurological reset, almost just like that.
Stretch reflex.
Yeah, just like a little reset button on your fire alarm. But it reboots the communication between the joint and the central nervous system. So you get a flood of proprioceptive input where the local reflexes can recalibrate and the segment regains coordinated function. So with that, there's also the effect on the muscle tone. So you'll often see hypertonic muscles chill out post-adjustment, not because we're pushing that bone back into its place, but because we are rebalancing how the nervous system controls those muscles, basically just going right off of what Eddie just said earlier. So if a subluxation is a joint not moving right, then the adjustment is the input that brings motion and function back. It's not magic, it's biochemistry and neurophysiology.
Agreed, and the effect that we can have on the muscles and the ligaments it's that stretch reflex, right? Like when these muscles have entered that vicious sympathetic cycle, what you're doing is you're breaking that and you're allowing the muscles to communicate with the dorsal root ganglion so that they can further communicate with the cerebellum, right? So that they can do their proprioceptive role, and so that then the frontal motor cortex can then tell them what to do when it comes to motion. That's put into really layman's terms. I bet CJ can go into it a little bit further than I can, but
I think we all have to remember that when it comes to the broad scale impact of a chiropractic adjustment, when it comes to interacting with the muscles and the ligaments and the spinal nerves that are coming out of the vertebrae, and when we're implementing that adjustment on a hypomobile segment, it's not as simple as just what's happening locally, but there is a signal that's always going to the brain. Mm-hmm. So the effects of an adjustment really depend on how the prefrontal cortex is taking in the rest of that information. And there's a study that I wanted to kind of just introduce to everybody, not necessarily go over in depth, but there is I can just hit escape.
Move the mouse over. So
Click.
Now escape.
Oh no, escape.
There we go.
Oh.
Here, give me this.
Whoops a daisy.
Technological difficulties.
Should we do like a little
do 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 do. There we go. Hey.
All right. This is a study on a systematic review or meta-analysis, actually, of mechanisms of manipulation and systematic review of the literature on immediate anatomical structure and positional changes. I think the study ended up pulling from a pool of like 34,000 articles that did studies on manipulation, and they ended up choosing, I think it was around 20 articles that fit all the exact criteria that they were looking for. And you guys can go and you guys can read that on your own. But there's three main things that we have to think about. So you have what's happening at the ligamentous level, what's happening at the muscle level, and then what's happening in terms of the neurological information that's going up to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, when we're talking about relaxing paraspinal musculature, has to do with the inflammatory signal after the initial mechanoreception reaches the prefrontal cortex and then sends that information back down to that spinal level and causes the sympathetic nervous system to relax.
Yep.
Because when we know what we know about the nervous system is it acts as an all or nothing. You have fight or flight, and then you have rest and digest. When the body's in fight or flight, it doesn't necessarily just control one organ or one muscle. It's the combined effects, the release of cortisol, that causes the body to be in that fight or flight state. So when you have the hypertonic paraspinal musculature, if you deliver a high velocity, low amplitude adjustment to the dysfunctional segments, the hypomobile segments, that inflammatory signal to the prefrontal cortex then changes. So we have the stretch reflex, the reciprocal inhibition of the deep paraspinal musculature, the conditioning of the ligaments. So something that I talked about earlier, when a ligament becomes disused and immobile, it ends up in some cases becoming more so calcified, and then you have to then stretch that ligament. You have to provide an impulse into that ligament in order to allow it to function again. The disc is a ligament. The disc is going to have an effect. It's going to react to your high velocity, low amplitude thrust. And then how do those signals from the mechanoreceptors, things like deep pressure, light touch, vibration travel up the spinal cord to then go to the prefrontal cortex and affect things like the vagus nerve. That's a little bit more of a complicated topic that we could get into another time.
Yeah.
And then the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and then as well as affecting different nuclei in the prefrontal cortex, like the dorsolateral and then the ventral medial.
So tying that back to what we just talked about with that component model where there's a lot of stuff going on with the subluxation, we as chiropractors are going in to do an adjustment, which is a specific thrust in the area of dysfunction that we find in the spine. And now that specific movement that we put in with, the intention of giving function back to the body is affecting those different components, some directly, some indirectly, and that's giving us that, everything that CJ just talked about, that's giving us that effect. Now, there's the, deep physiological process, but that's what we're doing when we just say that somebody comes in, subluxation, situation happens, we're giving the adjustment, we're expecting your body to recalibrate and get back to the, functional level.
And then one more thing that I also wanted, that I forgot to mention, and there's research, and maybe I can find it. Move back over here. Maybe I can find it here. But there's also been proposed for a long time that DRG stimulation has something to do with this. And when you have the initial injury of the joint, inflammatory interleukins, interleukin 2, interleukin 6, interleukin 17, flood the area and cause and begin that inflammatory cascade that we learned about in immunology. When you stimulate the DRG with an adjustment to that area, it causes the release of interleukin 10 to then go down. So they did studies on rats where they removed the DRG in some cases, and then in other cases where they would stimulate it surgically with almost like an activator, and then they would test to see what would then flood that area. So one of the reasons for when we say that we decrease inflammation, if you have an inflammatory level disc where you have pooling, pitting edema, you have sudoriferous changes, and then you have increased blood flow to that area, you're also going to get that release of interleukin 10 with the stimulation of the DRG, which is just another effect of what happens when we adjust an area.
Yeah, no, totally. I think there's a lot of opinions nowadays on subluxations, and I think, even in our own classroom, we have, people that will almost like fight you over your opinion on it. I think that was like a pretty good breakdown overall of, the coined term subluxation.
Mm-hmm.
I know, at least for me, I lean a certain way when I think of the word. So I think my points kind of reflected that. But do you guys have anything else to add, or?
Really quickly, I just want to talk about the. Obviously, there's this massive battle of semantics, and that I think this is a bigger societal issue. But I think that all chiropractic students and everybody who practices chiropractic can agree on two things. Number one, a subluxation is, in its most basic definition, dysfunction of the spine.
Yes.
Right? Dysfunction of a vertebral joint. There is something going on there that is causing pathophysiological changes down the line. Now, whether you're in the camp of nerve pressure or you're in the camp of of proprioception. And I think there's merit to both of them, right? Like, I don't think that there's research for both of these.
People need to understand as well that nerve pressure does exist.
100%, yeah.
Even though the initial premise was based off of impingement, are there cases where one of our professors always likes to say that nerve pressure, that bone on nerve is only causing a subluxation like 14% of the time? I'm not exactly sure where that number came from. I think he showed me the study. But still, and then the impingement. So when you do have the inflammatory cascade of the body that then causes edema and swelling at the area of the injured joint, of the hypomobile joint, you are going to get some of that fluid that is then impinging on that nerve root and then can have that effect. The more severe in terms of the disc degeneration that's going on. So when people have a slipped disc or they have really bad sciatica, that pooling edema and that blood flow to that area does have a massive effect on what's going on at the area. And there's another study as well. So Stuart McGill did a study in, I think it was 1999, so a little outdated. But one of the effects that he found, and everyone who doesn't know who Stuart McGill is, he's kind of like the world back pain specialist.
Yeah.
One of the studies that he ran on manipulation was that when they manipulated a person with severe low back pain, they ended up getting the reciprocal inhibition and the relaxation of 27 or 17 surrounding muscles.
I think it was 17.
Of 17 surrounding up. So here it is, back pain and manipulation. So if you go down to the results and you guys read through that, you're going to find that one of the biggest effects that they had was the relaxation of the muscles around that. So we know for a fact, with all the research that we've seen over the course of the last 3 decades, that you are getting the relaxation of the musculature. And then one thing that we always look for in our evaluation, and then especially for something like low back pain, is what's happening to the paraspinal musculature, and then what can that tell us? So whenever a muscle is tight and it's rigid, that it's protecting instability a lot of the time. So are there things that we can do in order to cause a stability of those joints that's outside of the adjustment? Absolutely. But we know that if a person is having it, everything super duper tight, we can give them some relief with an adjustment while getting those effects on ligamentous degeneration and then with the disc as well. So I wanted to bring that up because I think we can do another episode on low back pain. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, we can do it. There's so much to low back pain.
That'd be a good topic. But I think that's pretty much our breakdown of subluxation and the physiological rationale behind the adjustment. I think I really do think that we made a lot of good points, and I think it was a good episode. I think if there's anything that we can discuss further, please let us know. If you want to check out any of the articles that CJ has shown you or we talked about, those are going to be in our. We're going to drop them in the show notes below, so you can click the link on any of those. Below that, you can also find our Instagram page and any of our other socials. But yeah, this has been the adjusted perspective, episode 2. What is a subluxation?
Awesome. Good job, guys.
Peace.